Russian winter invasions. The vast expanse of Russia has been a tantalizing prize for centuries. The vast resources and landmass, too much for many leaders to resist. While Russian soldiers do their part, they are often helped and sometimes hindered by General Winter, Russia's fickle ally. By 1812, the French Empire under Napoleon Bonaparte was in control of the majority of Western Europe, who soon turned his sights east towards Russia. The Russian Tsar Alexander I had signed a treaty with Napoleon years before, but in the intervening years, the Russians had drifted outside of the French emperor's influence. Napoleon had forced the Russians into the continental system, where European trade with Great Britain was banned. Initially supportive of the measure, as Russia's economy fell, Russia soon abandoned their treaty with France, once again conducting trade with the British. Assembled in Poland, the Grand Armée consisted of some 500,000 to 600,000 men. And on June 24, 1812, they crossed the Neman River, entering Russian territory. Opposing them, the Russians amassed around 500,000 to 600,000 troops, making the conflict the largest of the Napoleonic era. Only around a third of the Russian army was stationed at the Polish border, ready to stop the French, not knowing if Napoleon's objective was Moscow or St. Petersburg, and unwilling to face the Corsican general immediately. Russian strategy centered around utilizing the vast size of the country. Napoleon had hoped that a single decisive battle would decide the matter, one quick victory that would force Russia's capitulation, a strategy that had worked brilliantly against other European powers. Alexander I and his generals, however, opted for a scorched-earth policy. In the face of the French advance, the Russians withdrew, burning or destroying anything of use. When the Russians did turn and fight, Napoleon was not able to destroy them as he had hoped. On August 16th to 18th, both armies clashed at Smolensk, but the Russians fell back before being annihilated. At Borodino on September 7th, once again the French were victorious, but the Russians were able to escape to fight another day, though both sides endured tremendous casualties. A week after Borodino, the French army marched triumphantly into Moscow, where Napoleon awaited the Russian surrender. Instead, he found a nearly abandoned city. After a month of waiting, it was obvious that there would be no Russian surrender, and Napoleon reluctantly turned back home. The now hungry and exhausted French soldiers were subject to continual Cossack raids as they began their march back towards France. Although Napoleon had already suffered his heaviest losses, it was here that the Grand Armée faced another formidable opponent, General Winter. World of Tanks presents new commanders, including Arnold Schwarzenegger.
You have to go through me.
Try out our special code Tank Mania to get Excelsior, 250k in credits, and 7-day premium access. Get 3 free rental tanks for 10 battles each, including the Tiger 131, the Cromwell B, and the T-34-85M. Now this code is only for new players who register for the first time in the Wargaming portal. With World of Tanks, you can have massive battles, pick from a huge tank arsenal, and reenact historical tank encounters with your friends. Click the link in the description below and use our Tank Mania code today to join the fray, soldier. Come play the Holiday Ops event, now also on mobile and console. The extensive logistical preparation that had been made was not enough, as supply bases were too spread apart and roads were poor. Weakened by the long march and limited food, frostbite, gangrene, and hypothermia took their toll, and the invading soldiers died in droves. By the time the Grand Armée reached friendly territory, only 10 to 15% of its initial strength remained. Eerily paralleling the French invasion in 1812, over a century later another army would face the wrath of the Russian winter. In 1941, the Wehrmacht unleashed Operation Barbarossa, its aim to destroy and colonize the Soviet Union. On June 22nd, the German-led force launched the campaign, consisting of over 3.5 million soldiers from multiple Axis nations. Like Napoleon, Hitler was expecting one decisive victory to bring the Soviet Union to its knees. "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down," the dictator quipped. Initially, the Wehrmacht achieved considerable success. Caught off guard, the Red Army suffered titanic casualties, losing hundreds of thousands of men, as well as vast quantities of aircraft, tanks, and artillery pieces in the opening weeks of the invasion. The Soviets, however, did not surrender. They kept falling back, trading space for time. While the Germans and their allies pushed deeper into Soviet territory, supplies had to traverse ever-increasing distances to reach the front lines, straining their logistics system. Though facing increasing Soviet resistance, the Wehrmacht made tremendous headway, plunging deep into Soviet territory. By October 20th, Army Group Center was within 40 miles of Moscow. With the Soviet capital within reach, the weather conspired against the Germans. Autumn rains turned the dirt tracks of the Russian interior into thick mud, which mired tanks and transport vehicles as they tried to advance. Operations grounded to a halt until, ironically, cold weather froze the mud, allowing vehicles to advance once again. By late November, Army Group Center was within 12 miles of Moscow, and on December 2nd, a reconnaissance unit managed to move within 5 miles of city limits. It was then that General Winter launched his counteroffensive. The Germans lacked winter clothing, expecting a quick victory before the winter. The Wehrmacht had made preparations for warmer gear, but those were in staging areas in Poland, with ammunition and fuel prioritized instead. Unprepared for the sudden drop in temperature, weapons malfunctioned, vehicles failed to start after being shut off for the night, and field hospitals were inundated with cases of frostbite and hypothermia. Though they doggedly plowed onward, the Wehrmacht lost its momentum and combat efficacy mere miles from its objective. In desperation, soldiers looted civilian homes for coats, blankets, and anything else that would offer protection against the bitter cold. The sudden onset of winter gave the Russians time to prepare their response. The Russians struck the Germans, who fell back in spite of Hitler's order that they stand and fight. Thousands of prisoners were taken, and any forward momentum of the invasion dissipated. Never again would the Axis come this close to Moscow. The once inexorable advance stopped. Another victory for General Winter. Sometimes, General Winter is not an ally, but an enemy, actively working against Russian military efforts. In the winter of 1939 to 1940, the Soviet Union launched an incursion against neighboring Finland. In the ensuing conflict, the Finns managed to inflict massive casualties on the Red Army, employing guerrilla tactics to wear down their much more powerful opponent. The winter was one of the coldest on record, where any exposed flesh would suffer frostbite almost instantly. Bodies would freeze solid in minutes, and blizzard conditions would disrupt radio and other communication systems, ground aircraft, and render vehicles unusable. The Red Army was unprepared for this type of conflict. Winter clothing was unavailable, and the khaki-colored uniforms of the Soviets made them easy targets for Finnish snipers, who were camouflaged in white snowsuits. Finnish troops would move through the hinterlands on skis and snowshoes, while ponderous columns of Soviet infantry would flounder in deep snow drifts, unable to come to grips with their more mobile opponents. The Soviets would eventually win through sheer weight of numbers, but suffered almost 5 times as many casualties as their Finnish adversaries, with hundreds of thousands succumbing to frostbite, hypothermia, and other effects of the bitter climate. In the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the approaching winter conditions will provide its own challenges to the fighting. Many experts believe that the fighting will slow during the colder months, with major offensives put on hold until the spring. Just like in previous wars, the autumn rains caused quagmires of mud, which bogged down vehicles on both sides, slowing offensive and counteroffensive operations. While the coming freezing ground would alleviate this circumstance, both sides are hesitant to launch major major operations with winter fast approaching. One of the major concerns is logistics. Both sides are taking advantage of the slowdown in combat to rearm, resupply, and make other preparations for a renewal of fighting in the spring. Logistics is such a concern for the Russian military that it is believed that a major factor in the withdrawal of its troops from the city of Kherson was due to the approaching colder climate. The deep freeze of winter could potentially cut off the already overtaxed supply lines, stranding those stationed in the occupied city for months without resupply of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and other essentials. Camouflage is also a concern for the combatants. The lack of leaves and other vegetation to act as concealment makes tanks and other pieces of heavy equipment much easier to spot by drones and other forms of modern surveillance. It is considered by many to be prudent to wait until new growth in the spring in order to provide adequate cover for armored advances to either reclaim or take new territory. The combat that does take place will have a different dynamic than in earlier months. With shortened hours of daylight, night fighting will take on new significance, a realm of combat facilitated by modern night vision gear. Artillery can become more deadly as the hardened ground is more difficult to dig trenches and defensive positions, leaving troops exposed on open ground. In addition to the ever-present risks of frostbite and hypothermia common in frigid conditions, other medical difficulties will become apparent as a wounded soldier's chances for survival after being hit fall with the freezing temperatures. What is known is that both sides will have to take general winter into account as they make their plans for the next phase of operations. Wars have been fought in Russia for centuries, with Russia as both aggressor and defender. No matter why the conflict breaks out, however, what is certain is that General Winter is one of the most powerful and effective forces to engage in any conflict.